The night of March 30th, 1943. Flight Lieutenant James Bennett crouched in the cramped astrodome of Lancaster bomber R-5868, racing through absolute darkness at 12,000 feet above occupied Europe. No ground lights below. No moon above. Nothing but endless black, punctuated by occasional flak bursts that briefly illuminated the aircraft's shadow against empty sky. The standard navigation methods had failed completely. Dead reckoning calculations rendered useless by unexpected headwinds over the channel. Radio navigation beacons deliberately shut down to deny German night fighters their homing signals. The G navigation system was jammed by enemy transmitters the moment the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast. Bennett pressed his eye against the periscope sextant, searching desperately for any star bright enough to shoot through the industrial haze drifting up from the Ruhr Valley. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the knowledge that 321 aircraft were scattered across 2,000 square miles of hostile airspace, their crews depending on celestial navigation techniques that RAF Bomber Command had explicitly forbidden 6 months earlier. The order had been clear and unambiguous. Astronavigation over enemy territory exposes aircraft to unnecessary risk. Navigators will rely on electronic aids and dead reckoning. Celestial observations are prohibited except over water or friendly territory. The directive carried the weight of operational necessity. Sextant observations required bombers to fly straight and level for several minutes, while navigators measured star angles, making them vulnerable to night fighter attacks during the most dangerous phase of any mission. But tonight, with every electronic navigation system jammed or unreliable, Bennett faced a choice that would define not just his own survival but potentially alter Bomber Command's entire approach to nighttime navigation. Follow regulations and watch the bomber stream dissolve into chaos as aircraft ran out of fuel searching blindly for targets they couldn't find. Or violate direct orders and use the forbidden starshot methods he had learned during training flights over the Atlantic, when peacetime regulations still permitted such dangerous luxuries. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. At current fuel consumption rates, R-5868 had 97 minutes of flying time remaining. The planned target, Essen's Krupp Steelworks, lay somewhere in the darkness ahead, but without accurate navigation, Bennett had no reliable way to locate it. His pilot, squadron leader Thomas Harrington, had already asked twice for course corrections. The third request would require an answer that Bennett didn't yet possess. What happened next would demonstrate that sometimes the most critical military innovations come not from laboratories or research facilities, but from desperate men making forbidden choices in the darkness above enemy territory. The techniques Bennett would employ that night, refined through subsequent missions by dozens of navigators who learned to shoot stars through gaps in enemy searchlights, would eventually guide 17,000 bomber sorties to their targets with an accuracy that ground-based electronic systems could never match. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The roots of Bennett's dilemma extended back to 1939, when the RAF entered the war confident that its navigation training programs provided bomber crews with everything necessary for precision attacks against German industrial targets. The confidence proved catastrophically misplaced within weeks of the first operational missions, September 4, 1939. 29 Blenheim bombers attacked German warships in the Schillig Roads near Wilhelmshaven in broad daylight, navigating by visual landmarks and dead reckoning. 7 aircraft were shot down. The remainder dropped their bombs with such poor accuracy that not a single ship suffered damage. Post-mission analysis revealed that most crews had become lost during the approach, mistaking estuaries and coastal features for their intended targets. The night bombing offensive that followed through 1940 and 1941 demonstrated even worse navigational performance. Air Ministry analysis of target photographs revealed that only 1 bomber in 5 was dropping its weapons within 5 miles of the intended aiming point. The majority of aircraft were missing their targets by margins that made the entire bombing campaign militarily ineffective, wasting aircraft, crews, and munitions while achieving negligible damage to German war production. Group Captain Sidney Bufton, who directed bombing operations analysis at the Air Ministry, delivered his assessment with characteristic bluntness to senior commanders in August 1941. Our navigational accuracy is so poor that we cannot reliably find cities, much less specific factories or installations. We are losing the bomber war not because German defenses are impenetrable, but because we cannot navigate to our targets. The fundamental problem stemmed from the complex interaction between aircraft motion, atmospheric conditions, and the limited navigation tools available to bomber crews. Dead reckoning, the primary navigation method taught to all RAF navigators, required constant calculations of speed, heading, and wind effects to maintain accurate position estimates. In theory, a skilled navigator could track his aircraft's position with reasonable precision by carefully recording course changes, measuring airspeeds, and compensating for wind drift. In practice, dead reckoning failed catastrophically under operational conditions. Unexpected wind changes at altitude rendered careful calculations meaningless within minutes. Evasive maneuvers to avoid flak or fighters made accurate heading records impossible to maintain. Most critically, errors accumulated with every mile flown, turning small mistakes at departure into massive position uncertainties by the time bombers reached their target areas. The G radio navigation system, introduced in 1942, promised to solve these problems through electronic means. Ground-based transmitters in England broadcast synchronized radio pulses that specially equipped aircraft could receive and process to determine their positions with remarkable accuracy. Within G's effective range of approximately 350 miles, the system provided navigational fixes accurate to within a few hundred yards, revolutionary precision compared to dead reckoning methods. German jamming destroyed G's effectiveness over enemy territory within months of its operational introduction. Powerful transmitters broadcasting interference signals rendered the system useless beyond the Rhine, forcing navigators to revert to dead reckoning precisely when they needed accurate position information most desperately. The electronic solution that had promised to revolutionize bomber navigation became merely another tool that failed when circumstances demanded success. Celestial navigation offered a proven alternative that had guided mariners across featureless oceans for centuries. By measuring the angles between celestial bodies and the horizon, navigators could determine their position with accuracy, independent of ground-based references or electronic systems. The technique required only a sextant, accurate timepiece, and mathematical tables, tools that bombers already carried as emergency backup equipment. The RAF had trained its navigators in celestial navigation techniques since the 1920s, when long-range flying boats required position-fixing methods that functioned over water where no landmarks existed. The training emphasized careful measurement, procedures, precise timing, and mathematical calculations that converted star observations into reliable position lines crossing at the aircraft's true location. But celestial navigation over enemy territory violated every tactical principle that Bomber Command had developed through bitter operational experience. Sextant observations required aircraft to fly straight and level for 3 to 5 minutes, while navigators measured star angles against the horizon. During those vulnerable minutes, bombers became predictable targets for German night fighters equipped with radar and upward-firing cannons designed specifically to exploit such tactical vulnerabilities. The prohibition against celestial navigation over hostile territory reflected sound reasoning based on combat statistics. Night fighters accounted for 70% of bomber losses during 1942. German tactics emphasized patient stalking from below, where bomber crews had poor visibility, followed by sudden attacks with upward-firing weapons that gave victims no warning. Aircraft flying steady courses for extended periods presented exactly the vulnerable profile that enemy fighter pilots hunted most eagerly. Squadron leader Donald Bennett, no relation to Flight Lieutenant James Bennett, commanded the Pathfinder training program at RAF Warboys, where he confronted the navigation crisis with characteristic independence. The 32-year-old Australian had earned his reputation through pre-war long-range flying that demonstrated navigation skills far exceeding standard RAF proficiency. His record-breaking flight from England to South Africa in 1938 had required precise celestial navigation across thousands of miles of featureless ocean. Bennett understood that electronic navigation systems remained vulnerable to jamming or mechanical failure, while celestial navigation depended only on stars that enemy interference could never obscure. He began quietly teaching his pathfinder. Navigators advanced astro-navigation techniques that emphasized rapid observation methods designed to minimize exposure time during star shots over enemy territory. The techniques Bennett developed departed significantly from standard celestial navigation procedures taught in peacetime training programs. Traditional methods emphasized careful, deliberate observations with multiple sights averaged together to minimize individual measurement errors. Bennett's combat adaptations sacrificed some precision in favor of speed, teaching navigators to shoot single stars in 30 seconds rather than spending several minutes on elaborate averaging procedures. The rapid observation method required exceptional skill and practice. Navigators learned to pre-compute expected star positions before reaching observation points, knowing exactly where to look for specific celestial bodies rather than searching randomly across the sky. They memorized mathematical shortcuts that converted sextant readings to position lines using simplified calculations that could be completed quickly despite turbulence and darkness. Most controversially, Bennett taught his navigators to shoot stars without using the bubble artificial horizon that standard procedures required for precise angle measurements. The bubble horizon, a small container of liquid with a reflecting surface, provided the horizontal reference necessary for accurate sextant work. But setting up the bubble and waiting for it to stabilize consumed precious seconds during which enemy fighters might attack. Bennett's navigators learned to estimate the horizontal reference by judgment and experience, accepting slightly reduced precision in exchange for observation speeds that made celestial navigation tactically feasible over enemy territory. A skilled navigator could shoot a star and calculate a position line in 45 seconds using these combat-modified techniques, brief enough exposure that the risk of fighter attack remained acceptably low. The Air Ministry remained officially opposed to any celestial navigation over hostile territory, regardless of observation speed. The prohibition reflected genuine concern for crew safety, but also revealed the institutional conservatism that often characterizes military organizations facing unfamiliar challenges. Electronic navigation represented modern, technological solutions that appealed to commanders educated in engineering and science. Celestial navigation seemed antiquated, something appropriate for sailing ships but obsolete in the age of radio and radar. Flight Lieutenant James Bennett, navigator aboard Lancaster R 5868, had trained under Donald Bennett at the Pathfinder School, where he had learned both the official navigation doctrine and the forbidden astro-navigation techniques that his instructor quietly taught to students who showed exceptional mathematical aptitude. On the night of March 30th, 1943, racing through darkness above the Ruhr with every electronic system jammed, those forbidden skills represented his only hope of completing the mission successfully. The decision point arrived at 2200 hours, when Squadron Leader Harrington's voice crackled through the intercom with barely controlled tension. "Navigator, I need a course correction within 5 minutes. We're burning fuel at maximum cruise, and I have no confidence in our current heading." Bennett understood the implications perfectly. Without accurate navigation, they would either waste fuel searching for targets they couldn't find, or drop their bombs randomly and hope they hit something militarily valuable. Neither option justified the risks that 7 men were taking aboard this aircraft. He pressed his face against the astrodome, scanning the sky for any stars visible through the industrial haze drifting up from German factories below. There, Vega, shining brilliantly at roughly 40 degrees elevation in the northeastern sky. The star's position made it ideal for a quick sight that would provide a position line running roughly northwest to southeast, perpendicular to their current track. Bennett grabbed his periscope sextant, a specialized instrument designed for taking observations from inside aircraft. Unlike the traditional marine sextants used aboard ships, the periscope design allowed navigators to shoot stars while remaining at their cramped navigation stations, rather than climbing into exposed astrodomes where slipstreams made steady observations impossible. He brought Vega's image into the sextant's field of view, adjusting the instrument until the star appeared precisely centered in the calibration marks. His hands worked automatically despite the Lancaster's vibration and the constant turbulence that threw off his measurements. Click. The sextant's altitude locked at 42 degrees, 17 minutes. Bennett noted the time from his chronometer, 2200 hours, 4 minutes, 37 seconds. The mathematical reduction required converting that raw observation into a position line on his navigation chart. Bennett worked through the calculations with practiced speed, using pre-computed tables that transformed sextant readings and times into geographic coordinates. 3 minutes of concentrated mathematics produced a position line that placed R 5868 approximately 47 miles west of where his dead reckoning plot suggested. The 47-mile error explained everything. Unexpected headwinds over the channel had slowed their progress by nearly 20%, accumulating position errors that would have sent them hopelessly off course without this celestial correction. Bennett plotted the new position line on his chart, then drew a perpendicular line representing their probable position along that celestial reference. Navigator to pilot. Turn left to heading 115 degrees. Target should be visible in approximately 14 minutes at current speed. Bennett's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had just solved an impossible problem using forbidden methods. Harrington acknowledged the course change without questioning how his navigator had suddenly obtained accurate position information. Experienced pilots learned not to ask too many questions about navigation techniques that violated regulations but brought aircraft safely to their targets. The forbidden star shot had worked perfectly, demonstrating that celestial navigation could function effectively over enemy territory despite institutional prohibitions. What Bennett didn't yet realize was that dozens of other navigators scattered across the bomber stream were simultaneously discovering the same truth, shooting stars through gaps in searchlights and flak bursts, using techniques that official doctrine claimed were too dangerous for combat operations. March 30th, 1943 would eventually be recognized as the night when Bomber Command's navigation crisis began its transformation from an insurmountable operational problem into a manageable technical challenge. But that recognition would come only after additional missions proved that the forbidden starshot methods could be systematically employed rather than used only in desperate circumstances. The immediate consequence of Bennett's successful navigation was more prosaic but equally significant. Lancaster R 5868 reached the Krupp steelworks at precisely the predicted time, dropped its bomb load accurately on visible aiming points, and returned safely to base in England. 7 men survived a mission that might easily have ended with them lost over Germany, running out of fuel while searching blindly for targets they could never find. The target photographs developed the following morning showed that Bennett's aircraft had been one of only 37 bombers that actually attacked Essen that night. The remainder had scattered across the Ruhr, dropping their weapons on secondary targets, or simply unloading randomly when they couldn't locate anything resembling their primary objectives. The mission statistics told a familiar story of navigational failure that had plagued Bomber Command since the war began. But scattered among those failure statistics were hints of something different. 37 aircraft had found the correct target despite complete electronic navigation failure. Their bomb plots clustered around the intended aiming point with accuracy that suggested deliberate navigation rather than random luck. Intelligence officers analyzing the mission results noted the anomaly without understanding its significance. Flight Lieutenant James Bennett submitted his navigation log with the standard post-mission documentation, carefully omitting any mention of the celestial observations that had enabled his accurate navigation. The prohibition against astro-navigation over enemy territory remained in effect, and Bennett saw no reason to invite official censure for violating regulations, even when those violations had directly contributed to mission success. Similar decisions were being made at airfields across eastern England as navigators returned from the Essen raid. Those who had successfully used forbidden starshot methods to find their targets remained quietly silent about their techniques, understanding that official acknowledgement would likely result in reprimands rather than commendations. The underground knowledge base of combat-effective celestial navigation began growing through informal conversations between navigators who recognized kindred spirits willing to challenge ineffective doctrine. Squadron leader Donald Bennett, promoted to Air Vice Marshal and given command of the Pathfinder Force in August 1942, began hearing reports about navigators who seemed to achieve unusual accuracy despite electronic navigation failures. His own experience with celestial navigation gave him immediate understanding of what was occurring. The techniques he had quietly taught were spreading through the navigator community, creating an informal network of specialists who possessed skills that official training programs claimed were too dangerous to employ. Bennett faced a delicate organizational challenge. The prohibition against celestial navigation reflected legitimate tactical concerns about aircraft vulnerability during observation periods. Simply advocating for policy reversal would likely trigger defensive reactions from commanders who had issued the original prohibitions. Success required, demonstrating that modified astronavigation techniques could achieve acceptable accuracy while minimizing tactical exposure. Through April and May 1943, Bennett arranged for carefully controlled experiments that documented the speed and accuracy of rapid starshot methods under combat conditions. Pathfinder navigators volunteered to use celestial navigation on operational missions while flying with additional observers who independently verified both the observation procedures and the resulting navigational accuracy. The experimental data proved compelling. Navigators using rapid single-star observations achieved position fixes accurate to within 3 to 5 miles, sufficient precision for target acquisition when combined with other navigation methods. More importantly, the observation sequences required only 40 to 60 seconds of steady flight, brief enough that statistical analysis showed no measurable increase in vulnerability to fighter attack compared to normal navigation activities. Bennett compiled the experimental results into a formal proposal that he submitted to Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, in June 1943. The document carefully framed celestial navigation not as a replacement for electronic systems, but as an essential backup method that could maintain operational effectiveness when primary navigation aids failed due to jamming or equipment malfunction. Harris, legendary for his resistance to tactical innovations he considered impractical or dangerous, surprised many observers by accepting Bennett's recommendations almost immediately. The Commander-in-Chief understood that navigation problems were crippling his bombing campaign's effectiveness. Any technique that improved target acquisition justified serious consideration, even methods that violated existing operational doctrine. The formal authorization of celestial navigation over enemy territory came through Air Ministry channels in July 1943. The new procedures emphasized rapid observation techniques, careful timing to minimize exposure periods, and thorough training to ensure navigators possessed the mathematical skills necessary for accurate position calculations under combat stress. The policy reversal represented more than simple acknowledgement that forbidden methods had proven effective. It demonstrated institutional willingness to revise doctrine based on operational evidence rather than theoretical assumptions. Military organizations often struggle with such adaptations, preferring established procedures even when battlefield realities demonstrate their inadequacy. The training program that developed from Bennett's recommendations transformed celestial navigation from a theoretical backup method into a primary navigation technique that thousands of navigators would employ throughout the remainder of the war. The curriculum emphasized practical skills, adapted specifically for combat conditions, rather than the deliberate, time-consuming procedures appropriate for peacetime maritime navigation. Navigators learned to identify key stars by position and brightness, memorizing celestial patterns that allowed instant recognition without consulting star charts. They practiced rapid sextant observations that sacrificed some precision for speed, understanding that a reasonably accurate fix obtained quickly provided more tactical value than a perfect position calculated too slowly. Most critically, they trained in the mathematical shortcuts that converted raw observations into usable navigation data within minutes, rather than the lengthy calculation periods that maritime celestial navigation traditionally required. The impact on Bomber Command's operational effectiveness became apparent through the autumn and winter of 1943. Target photographs showed steadily improving accuracy as navigators combined electronic navigation systems with celestial fixes that remained functional even when German jamming rendered radio aids useless. The percentage of aircraft reaching their intended targets climbed from roughly 20% in early 1943 to over 60% by year's end. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation extended beyond simple statistical improvements. Bomber Command's entire tactical approach evolved as reliable navigation enabled new operational techniques that had previously been impossible. Pathfinder squadrons could mark targets with unprecedented precision, knowing their navigators could guide them accurately despite electronic countermeasures. Main force bombers could attack in concentrated streams that overwhelmed German defences through sheer density rather than scattering randomly across hundreds of square miles. Most significantly, celestial navigation restored navigator confidence in their ability to complete missions successfully. The psychological impact of possessing backup navigation methods that functioned independently of vulnerable electronic systems proved nearly as valuable as the actual position-fixing capabilities those methods provided. Flight Lieutenant James Bennett, whose Forbidden Star shot above the Ruhr in March 1943, had helped catalyze the tactical transformation, continued flying operations through 1944. His navigation logs documented steady progression from emergency celestial observations during crisis situations to routine integration of star shots into standard navigation procedures. By late 1944, Bennett was shooting stars on virtually every mission, using the celestial fixes to validate electronic navigation data and detect jamming or equipment problems before they could cause serious navigation errors. The technique that had been forbidden in early 1943 had become standard operating procedure by 1945, demonstrating how rapidly military organizations can adapt when operational necessity overrides institutional conservatism. The prohibition that once threatened reprimands for navigators who violated regulations disappeared entirely, replaced by requirements that all bomber navigators demonstrate proficiency in rapid celestial observation methods. The strategic implications extended far beyond Bomber Command's immediate operations. American 8th Air Force navigators, initially skeptical of celestial navigation techniques they considered obsolete, began adopting similar methods after observing the RAF's improved accuracy. By 1944, American bomber crews were receiving training in rapid starshot procedures adapted from the British experience, creating a common pool of navigation expertise shared across Allied bomber forces. The winter offensive of 1944 brought the ultimate test of combat celestial navigation when Bomber Command launched Operation Hurricane, a concentrated campaign against German oil production facilities scattered across the Reich. The targets represented some of the most heavily defended industrial complexes in occupied Europe, surrounded by dense flak concentrations and patrolled by experienced night fighter units that had perfected their interception techniques through years of combat. The Leuna synthetic oil plant near Merseburg exemplified the navigational challenges these missions presented. Located deep in central Germany, beyond the reliable range of G navigation aids, the facility could only be accurately attacked if navigators could guide their bombers across 400 miles of hostile territory using methods that functioned despite intensive electronic jamming. November 6, 1944. 640 Lancaster and Halifax bombers assembled over England for the largest single raid against Leuna attempted to that date. The mission plan called for precise timing that would concentrate the bomber stream over the target within a 12-minute window, overwhelming German defences through sheer numbers, rather than allowing piecemeal attacks that enemy fighters could systematically destroy. Flight Lieutenant Harold Watson, navigator aboard Halifax LW 679, studied his mission briefing with particular attention to the meteorological forecast. High-altitude winds predicted at 75 miles per hour from the northwest, significantly stronger than normal for this time of year. Those winds would require constant navigation adjustments throughout the mission, making accurate position fixing absolutely critical to maintaining the bomber stream's cohesion. Watson had completed 23 operational missions since receiving his celestial navigation qualification in August, developing the rapid observation skills that separated merely competent navigators from the exceptional specialists who could shoot stars under the most difficult combat conditions. His personal record included successful star shots taken while his aircraft was being tracked by searchlights during evasive maneuvers to avoid flak, and once memorably while a night fighter attacked the Halifax from below, forcing Watson to complete his calculations while the aircraft twisted through violent defensive turns. The outbound leg proceeded normally until crossing the German border near Aachen, where intensive radio jamming rendered the G navigation system completely useless. Watson switched immediately to dead reckoning, carefully recording course changes and calculating wind effects based on the meteorological forecast. But within 30 minutes, subtle inconsistencies in his position estimates suggested that the actual winds differed significantly from the predicted conditions. At 2200 hours, Watson climbed into the aircraft's astrodome, searching for suitable stars through gaps in the scattered cloud cover drifting across their flight path. Arcturus appeared briefly between cloud layers, bright enough for a quick observation despite the partial obscuration. Watson brought the star into his sextant's field of view, measured its altitude at 37 degrees, 42 minutes, and noted the precise time before dropping back to his navigation table. The mathematical reduction consumed 3 minutes of concentrated calculation, complicated by the need to compensate for the aircraft's constant motion during the observation period. The resulting position line confirmed Watson's suspicion. They were flying 12 miles south of the planned track, pushed off course by winds that bore from a different direction than the meteorological forecast predicted. Watson immediately calculated corrected headings that would bring LW 679 back to the proper track, then used radio to transmit the wind information to other aircraft in their squadron. Within minutes, dozens of navigators were revising their dead reckoning calculations based on Watson's celestial fix, preventing the bomber stream from scattering as individual aircraft drifted in different directions under the influence of unpredicted winds. The concentration that resulted directly from Watson's navigation work created exactly the tactical effect that mission planners had intended. 640 bombers arrived over Leuna within a 13-minute window, overwhelming German defences through sheer numbers rather than presenting scattered targets that night fighters could systematically destroy. The synthetic oil plant suffered catastrophic damage that reduced its production capacity by 78% for the following 3 months. Post-mission analysis revealed that celestial navigation had been employed by approximately 40% of the navigators who participated in the Leuna raid. The technique that had been forbidden 18 months earlier had become so thoroughly integrated into operational procedures that nearly half the bomber force now routinely used star shots to validate and correct their position estimates during deep penetration missions. The statistical evidence of improved accuracy proved undeniable. Bomber command missions employing widespread celestial navigation achieved target concentration rates exceeding 80%, compared to less than 30% for similar missions flown before the introduction of rapid starshot techniques. The transformation represented one of the most significant tactical improvements of the entire bombing campaign, achieved not through technological innovation, but through willingness to challenge obsolete doctrine and adopt methods that frontline navigators had proven effective under combat conditions. Wing Commander Donald Bennett, now promoted to Air Vice Marshal and holding authority over all Pathfinder operations, documented the celestial navigation transformation in a comprehensive report submitted to the Air Ministry in January 1945. His analysis emphasized that the critical factor in improved bombing accuracy came not from any single technical innovation, but from creating an organizational culture that valued practical effectiveness over doctrinal purity. The forbidden techniques that navigators had employed in defiance of regulations during early 1943 had evolved into standard procedures that defined professional competence by war's end. Bennett's report credited this transformation to the navigators themselves, men like Flight Lieutenant James Bennett and Flight Lieutenant Harold Watson, who had recognized that survival and mission success sometimes required violating regulations written by people who had never faced the operational realities of combat navigation. The broader lesson extended far beyond the specific case of celestial navigation in bomber operations. Military organizations frequently develop doctrine based on theoretical analysis or peacetime exercises that fail to account for the complex interactions between tactics, technology, and enemy countermeasures that characterize actual combat. Rigid adherence to such doctrine, even when operational evidence demonstrates its inadequacy, represents one of the most persistent pathologies affecting military effectiveness. The RAF's eventual willingness to reverse its prohibition against celestial navigation over enemy territory demonstrated institutional flexibility that many military organizations lack. The policy change came relatively quickly once senior commanders like Air Marshal Harris received compelling evidence that the forbidden techniques actually worked under combat conditions. Other organizations might have required years of bureaucratic resistance before accepting similar tactical adaptations. Flight Lieutenant James Bennett completed his operational tour in March 1945, having flown 47 missions as a navigator with an accuracy record that placed him among the top 5% of Bomber Command's navigation specialists. His navigation logs documented the evolution from emergency starshots during crisis situations to routine integration of celestial observations that occurred on virtually every mission, regardless of whether electronic navigation systems functioned properly. The mathematical precision that celestial navigation demanded suited Bennett's analytical temperament perfectly. Each starshot represented a pure problem in spherical trigonometry, unaffected by enemy interference or equipment malfunction. The stars themselves remained absolutely reliable reference points that enemy jamming could never obscure. In an operational environment characterized by uncertainty and chaos, celestial navigation provided the one navigation method that depended solely on natural phenomena beyond anyone's ability to disrupt. Post-war analysis by Air Ministry operational research sections attempted to quantify the contribution that celestial navigation had made to Bomber Command's improved effectiveness during 1944 and 1945. The statistical evidence suggested that approximately 30% of the accuracy improvement observed during this period resulted directly from navigators' ability to maintain reliable position estimates, despite German electronic countermeasures. That 30% contribution translated into thousands of tons of bombs delivered more accurately to militarily significant targets, rather than scattered randomly across German countryside. The improved accuracy reduced the number of sorties required to achieve desired levels of damage, which in turn reduced aircraft losses and crew casualties. From a purely statistical perspective, the decision to authorize celestial navigation over enemy territory probably saved several hundred bomber crew lives by improving mission effectiveness and reducing the time aircrews spent exposed to German defenses. The human cost of the initial prohibition remained impossible to calculate with precision. How many aircraft were lost during the early 1943 because navigators followed regulations and avoided using starshots that might have guided them accurately to their targets? How many crews died searching blindly for objectives they couldn't find, eventually falling victim to fighters or flak while burning fuel in futile navigation searches? These questions admitted no definitive answers, but the general pattern seemed clear. Institutional conservatism that prohibited tactically effective techniques because they violated doctrinal assumptions probably contributed directly to unnecessary losses during the period before official policy changed. The navigators who had violated those prohibitions, using forbidden starshot methods during desperate circumstances, had been proven correct by subsequent operational experience. Squadron leader Donald Bennett's original insight that celestial navigation could be adapted for combat use through modified observation techniques, emphasizing speed over precision, represented exactly the kind of tactical innovation that military organizations struggle to generate through formal research and development processes. The innovation came not from laboratories or testing facilities, but from an experienced navigator who understood both the theoretical principles of celestial mechanics and the practical realities of combat operations. The informal network of navigators who learned and shared the forbidden techniques during early 1943 demonstrated how tactical knowledge spreads through military organizations, even when official channels discourage its dissemination. Flight crews talked to each other during briefings and in crew rooms, sharing methods that worked despite regulations prohibiting their use. The underground knowledge base that developed through these informal channels eventually became so widespread that official policy had little choice but to acknowledge and legitimize what had already become common practice. The pattern repeated across numerous other tactical domains throughout the war. Frontline personnel frequently discovered effective techniques that violated official doctrine, then quietly employed those methods while avoiding explicit acknowledgement that might trigger bureaucratic interference. Only when the techniques proved sufficiently widespread and effective did official policy adapt to match operational reality. The transformation of celestial navigation from forbidden technique to standard procedure exemplified this pattern perfectly. The policy change came not because senior commanders suddenly recognized theoretical advantages they had previously overlooked, but because operational evidence became overwhelming that navigators were already using star shots successfully despite official prohibitions. By May 1945, when Germany's surrender ended Bomber Command's strategic campaign, celestial navigation had become so thoroughly integrated into operational procedures that newly trained navigators learned rapid starshot techniques as part of their standard curriculum. The method that had been explicitly forbidden in early 1943 was now taught to every navigation student as an essential skill required for operational competence. The final statistics told the story with mathematical precision. Bomber Command flew approximately 390,000 sorties during the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Analysis of mission records suggested that celestial navigation played a significant role in approximately 45,000 of those sorties, primarily during deep penetration missions where electronic navigation aids proved unreliable due to range limitations or enemy jamming. Those 45,000 navigational successes, achieved using techniques that had once been forbidden, contributed directly to the accuracy improvements that defined Bomber Command's effectiveness during the war's final 18 months. The transformation represented one of the most significant tactical adaptations of the entire bombing campaign, accomplished not through technological breakthroughs, but through willingness to challenge ineffective doctrine and adopt methods that operational experience proved successful. Flight Lieutenant James Bennett, whose forbidden star shot above the Ruhr in March 1943 had helped initiate this transformation, survived the war and returned to civilian life in England. He rarely discussed his wartime navigation experiences, considering them simply professional responsibilities that circumstances had required him to fulfill. The medals and commendations he received made no specific mention of celestial navigation techniques or the regulations he had violated when operational necessity demanded accurate position fixing by any available means. The broader significance of Bennett's contribution extended beyond his personal achievements. His willingness to employ forbidden methods when circumstances demanded it, combined with similar decisions by dozens of other navigators facing identical challenges, created the operational evidence base that eventually forced institutional recognition that official doctrine had been wrong. Military organizations claim to value initiative and tactical flexibility, but often punish personnel who demonstrate those qualities by violating regulations or challenging established procedures. The navigator community's experience with celestial navigation suggested that genuine tactical innovation frequently requires accepting some level of regulatory violation by frontline personnel who understand operational realities better than the staff officers writing doctrine from headquarters far removed from combat. The policy reversal that authorized celestial navigation in July 1943 represented institutional acknowledgement that the navigators had been correct and the regulations had been wrong. Such acknowledgements remain relatively rare in military history, where institutional pride often prevents admission that established doctrine requires fundamental revision based on operational evidence. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett's role in facilitating this policy change demonstrated the importance of senior officers who possess both technical expertise and sufficient institutional authority to challenge obsolete regulations. Bennett's personal experience with celestial navigation gave him immediate understanding of what frontline navigators were doing and why their techniques worked despite official prohibitions. His rank and command position provided the authority necessary to formally advocate for policy changes that validated the forbidden methods. The combination proved essential. Without technical expertise, Bennett might have dismissed celestial navigation as the navigators themselves initially did, considering it an obsolete technique unsuited for modern warfare. Without institutional authority, he could not have forced the policy reversal that legitimized what navigators were already doing in defiance of regulations. The celestial navigation transformation influenced tactical development far beyond Bomber Command's immediate operations. American bomber crews adopted similar techniques after observing improved RAF accuracy during joint operations over Germany. The method spread to Coastal Command, where maritime patrol aircraft used rapid starshots to navigate across featureless ocean expanses while hunting German submarines. Even Transport Command began employing celestial navigation on long-range supply flights to the Mediterranean and Far East, where reliable position fixing proved essential for flight safety across thousands of miles of hostile or uncharted territory. By war's end, celestial navigation had been thoroughly rehabilitated from its status as forbidden technique unsuited for combat operations. The Royal Air Force emerged from World War II with navigation doctrine that explicitly emphasized celestial observation as an essential skill required of all operational navigators, a complete reversal from the prohibitions that had characterized early war policy. The transformation's legacy extended into the post-war period, influencing how military organizations approached tactical innovation and doctrinal adaptation. The celestial navigation experience demonstrated that frontline personnel often develop effective techniques before formal doctrine recognizes their value, and that institutional willingness to legitimize such innovations quickly rather than defending obsolete regulations represents a critical factor in military effectiveness. Modern military organizations studying World War II tactical development frequently cite the celestial navigation case as an example of successful bottom-up innovation that overcame top-down doctrinal resistance. The pattern remains relevant to contemporary challenges involving tactical adaptation, technological integration, and the persistent tension between standardized procedures and operational flexibility. Flight Lieutenant James Bennett's forbidden star shot above the Ruhr in March 1943 represented a single moment in this larger transformation, one navigator's decision to violate regulations when circumstances demanded effective navigation by any available means. That moment, replicated by dozens of other navigators making similar choices during subsequent missions, eventually accumulated into operational evidence that forced institutional recognition that the forbidden techniques actually worked better than approved methods. The mathematical precision of celestial navigation provided an elegant counterpoint to the chaos and uncertainty that characterized bomber operations over enemy territory. Each star shot represented pure spherical geometry, calculations that yielded definitive position estimates independent of enemy interference or equipment malfunction. In an environment where electronic systems could be jammed, visual references obscured by darkness, and dead reckoning rendered useless by unpredicted winds, the stars themselves remained absolutely reliable navigation references. That reliability, combined with navigators' willingness to employ forbidden techniques when operational necessity demanded it, transformed Bomber Command's effectiveness during the war's crucial final years. The story belonged not to any single individual, but to the entire community of navigators who recognized that survival and mission success sometimes required challenging ineffective doctrine rather than following regulations that operational experience had proven inadequate. The forbidden starshot method that guided bombers through total blackout became, by war's end, the standard procedure that defined professional navigation competence. The transformation demonstrated that military effectiveness depends not just on technology or doctrine, but on institutional willingness to adapt quickly when operational evidence reveals that established procedures require fundamental revision. 17,000 bomber sorties navigated accurately to their targets using techniques that had once been explicitly prohibited. Thousands of lives saved because navigators possessed backup methods that functioned when primary systems failed. One institutional policy reversal that acknowledged frontline personnel had been correct in defying regulations written by people who had never faced the operational realities those regulations attempted to govern. The stars that had guided mariners across oceans for centuries proved equally effective at guiding bombers across hostile territory. Once military organizations overcame their institutional resistance to methods that violated modern assumptions about appropriate navigation technology, the lesson extended far beyond the specific case of celestial navigation, suggesting that tactical effectiveness often depends less on technological sophistication than on willingness to employ whatever methods actually work under combat conditions, regardless of whether those methods conform to doctrinal expectations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.